Hello and welcome to the Patrick Heath Public Library and Boerne Book and Arts Festival. My name is Karen Creech and I work with both of those organizations. And I would like to welcome you to our penultimate panel discussion for the book festival this weekend. We have one more this afternoon and all of them have been great. So thank you to the attendees joining us today and also our esteemed panelists. I did want to mention James Hornfischer unfortunately had to drop out and he's not going to be with us today, but he did want to thank his readers, and we do have signed book plates for him. So if you want a book by James Hornfischer, we do have signed book plates and you can get a book signed. And then speaking of books, if you want to order any books by the authors, the featured titles are on our website, and I'll post the website in the chat. And if you want to order through us, please get your order in sometime by the end of this evening. I'll be placing an order with our vendors in the morning. And each of the authors have been gracious to sign book plates for us, so you will in effect get a signed copy of the book. If you don't see your favorite title on the shop, email me. After almost 30 years of working at Barnes & Noble, it's ingrained in my system to try to get a book, whatever book you want. So I will try to get it. I'm going to introduce our moderator, and thank you, Captain Tammie Jo Shults, for moderating this session for us. Sure. Captain Tammie Jo Shults became an aircraft carrier qualified naval aviator and earned her wings at Naval Air Station Beeville, Texas. She then served as a flight instructor in the T-2 Buckeye before going on to fly as an electronic aggressor pilot on the A-7 Corsair and the FA-18 Hornet. She was one of the first females qualified to fly on the Hornet. Until just recently, she flew with Southwest Airlines. She began this career in 1994 and took her final commercial flight this past August. Although her chapter as a commercial pilot is behind her, Captain Shults will continue to fly privately, serve as a volunteer pilot, and assume the role alongside her husband Dean as board members of the nonprofit organization Angel Flight South Central. Tammie Jo Shults was the captain of Flight 1380, Southwest Airlines. Much of the details of this flight are chronicled in her memoir, Nerves of Steel. And just on a personal note, I just want to thank you, Tammie Jo. We're so fortunate to have you in our community because you're such a great friend to this library and have added so much value to any of the programs, and you always say yes whenever we ask you to help. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Karen. And I have to tell you, reading is one of those lifelong hobbies. So those of you that enjoy reading, you're going to enjoy these two books. These two authors are amazing. True stories are really what I choose, first of all. And World War II is one of those amazing swaths of time and swaths of people. We get to start today with Alex Kershaw. And I'll read you just a little bit. There's not enough time to even read his full bio because he is such an accomplished author. But Alex is an honorary colonel in the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division, and is widely acclaimed as an award-winning author of several New York Times bestseller books about World War II, including The Bedford Boys, The Longest Winter, The Few, Escape from the Deep, The Liberator, and Avenue of Spies. A graduate of University College, Oxford, he worked as a journalist for The Guardian and other newspapers before moving to the US in 1994. Welcome, Alex. His latest book is The First Wave, and that's what we're going to be covering today about D-Day. He lives in Savannah and regularly leads battlefield tours and lectures on World War II. His 2012 book, The Liberator, is being made into a drama series to be aired this November. Is that right?
Yeah, November the 11th.
Very good. Well, we're excited to see that. Alex, before we ask you to just unfold some of your book for us, I have to read the quote from part 1, Twilight of Idols. It's really kind of the first thing in your book, but I think it sets the scene so well. When you talk about combat leadership under fire on the beach at Normandy, I don't see how the credit can go to any other than the company grade officers and senior NCOs who led the way. It is good to be reminded that there are such men, that there always have been and there always will be. We sometimes forget, I think, that you can manufacture weapons, you can purchase ammunition, but you can't buy valor, and you can't pull heroes off an assembly line. Sergeant John Ellery, 16th Infantry Regiment, U.S. 1st Infantry Division. So I had a lump in my throat before I ever started reading your book. Thank you. I have to say, I think this is such a great time to be reminded that we have a history of, our history isn't grounded in hate, it's grounded in love of freedom. And so give us an overview of D-Day. And could you set up a little bit beforehand so that if people step into this book, they have a little bit of the setting before they set into reading?
Yeah, sure. Well, the point of the book was that I wanted as many people as possible to be able to really understand what it was like to be at the sharp end on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, probably the most important day in modern European history, maybe world history, certainly a day that all Americans for 76 years now should be extremely proud of. And so much has been written about D-Day that I thought, the 75th anniversary was coming up. They wanted to publish in time for that. And I thought, is there a different way of doing it, a way that would be fun for me and hopefully fun for the reader? So I thought, why don't I just pick the superstars? Why don't I just pick the super warriors, the guys that had, the most important jobs, where the stakes were highest and who were most likely to get killed. And those are the guys, the junior officers from, I think the highest rank I have is a major. So I took 10 guys across the Allied nations. I've got 2 Canadian brothers, 4 Yanks, 4 Brits, even a Frenchman. And I wanted to follow them very, very closely. So I got a really tight focus from their point of view. Some big picture stuff. I wanted to set about why D-Day was important, why the invasion of Normandy was so critical. I wanted to give Allied Supreme Commander Eisenhower a role within this. But really, I wanted to show people what it was like to get off those landing craft, to jump out of a plane into the darkness, to get the job done and to put your life on the line at the moment when you were most likely to pay the highest price, to give a kind of visceral adrenaline rush read. And I have to be honest, I threw in a couple of British guys who've been written about before, but I adore them. I worship them. A guy called Lord Lovat and John Howard. I mean, when I was a boy, I used to watch things like The Longest Day, movies. I read a ton of comics, tons and tons of comics. I was just obsessed with a kind of comic book version of World War II. So when I got the actual chance to write about D-Day, some of these superstars, legends for me, I was like, this is great, this is fun. So anyway, I won't bang on too much, but it was trying to make D-Day really cool and sexy and not too academic. I hate academic history. I'll be honest with you. I think about the reader. I want people to turn the page. I want them to be in the heart and the mind and feel it spiritually. I want them to be in the heart of combat and really understand perhaps a little bit what it was like to fight so hard and win our freedom and bring peace and democracy back to Europe. So yeah.
Right. Well, and you do a wonderful balance of giving us kind of a bird's eye view, and then a taste of the weather, the land, and then what happens in it. And one of the things that I noticed as I was reading your book, and I'd mention it to friends along the way, what I was reading about, because when you read a good book, you want to talk about it. So it was kind of fun to just start sharing with some of my friends what I'm reading. And And one of the things that, and I kind of expanded out, because as I was reading yours, I realized, okay, why did the Germans not expect us at Pointe du Hoc? You know, and then I found out that, well, we had, the Allies had created this fake rubber army of about a million people in tanks and trucks and things like that at Kent, right across from Calais, which is the closest spot. So that's where they expected it, and it would be easier to do. But I thought, so that's kind of interesting, all the maneuverings. But so many people that I asked, where do you think D-Day began? They all began on the beach, not in the paratroopers that came in at, what was it, 12:15 at night?
Yeah, yeah.
So give us a little bit of what their purpose was. You know,
Right.
the guys on the beach is what we all see.
Can I ask you a question? What is this here? Is that your Southwest Airlines? What is this?
Oh, those are my Navy wings.
Wow.
My Navy wings.
You are so much more interesting than me or anybody else on this. You're a Navy.
Not at all.
You're a Navy pilot. Come on, my God.
Oh,
Please
well,
accept that that's a very special thing. So can I tell you a little story? When I was
sure.
23, my sisters, I'm getting off track here, but this is much more interesting. But it will come back to your question. I promise.
Okay.
When I was 23, 24, I flew in the back of a Hawk, you know, an RAF Hawk, those training planes.
Right.
So I was in the back seat. I was upside down at like 500 miles an hour at, 300 or 400 feet above the ground. It was probably a bit too low. And the guy in front of me had the bone dome on, and I had my, the G-force came in, and my, I had a sick bag in each pocket and each leg. And I was just in awe. I was like, oh my God, this person in front of me is actually can do something. They're highly functional. I've always been completely dysfunctional in my entire life, my entire 54 years. And I'm like, oh my God, this person's flying a $20 million piece of machinery. They're like only a few years older than me. Wow, this is like a superhuman. So I'm now speaking to you as a complete superhuman, because not only are you a superhuman, you're a female superhuman. And I'm so proud of what you achieved, what you did for women, what you've done for everybody to inspire people that they can do what was always thought of as being a man's job. So thank you so much. Are you sure that you're happily married? Are you sure you're happily married? Anyway, so I don't have the media. I don't have the media here, but what I was going to say is that the very first people that went into combat, if you like, on D-Day, and there were many D-Days in World War II. This is just the most famous, June the 6th. In the Pacific, there were many, many. And in Europe, actually, before June the 6th, 1944, we'd had 4 D-Days there already in North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio. So most people think that D-Day, 6th of June, is the only D-Day. There's one of many. But D-Day means Operation Day. It means Invasion Day. So anyway, about 9:57 p.m. on the 5th of June in England, a C-47 took off from North Witham Airfield, and it was piloted by a guy called Joel Crouch, who was a United Airlines pilot. Sorry, it's not a Southwest Airlines pilot. I don't think
we weren't alive yet.
No, you weren't there, but I'm sure if you had been, he would have been your star pilot, because he was a superstar. And you know all about C-47s, and he took off. And I was there at the runway recently. He took off at 9:57 p.m., just as it was getting dark, and there's a beautiful photographs you can find. Joel Crouch with Stick 1 of the 101st Airborne. They were pathfinders. Their job was to jump out and set up beacons and lights to guide in this beautiful sky train of 101st Airborne, 6,500 Screaming Eagles that were going to jump around about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning on June the 6th. So officially, he was the first guy to take off and go into combat, if you like. And he took off at that 10 o'clock, and he arrived over Normandy, and the green light went on. The red light goes on first, and the guys sitting in the back, they're all lined up, they're hooked up. There's 18 guys in this stick of paratroopers, they're pathfinders. And at 12:15, the green light went on, and they jumped out, and they became the first Americans Stick 1 of the Pathfinder unit of the 101st Airborne became the very first Americans to fight on D-Day, and they actually landed after the drop was only from like 300 or 400 feet, very, very low indeed, ridiculously low, and it lasted about less than 20 seconds. So you came out and you had 20 seconds. The parachute was out almost immediately, and they landed at 12:15. In fact, the first guy to officially see combat, American, I should say, on D-Day was a guy called Frank Lillyman, and his boots touched the ground in Normandy at 12:15 a.m. So he literally was the first of the American first wave. But it was Joel Crouch, the pilot, of your professional breed, that was the first guy really to lay it on the line and take those guys into combat in Normandy. So yeah, they were the paratroopers came first, and then the first Americans to arrive came in at 6:30 a.m. and they came in on 2 beaches. One was Utah and one was Omaha. There were 5 D-Day beaches. The Americans had 2, and the Brits had 2, and the Canadians had Juno. So it's 5 beaches altogether, spread out over 50 miles. 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne were dropped around Saint Mary-Église behind Utah to secure exits from Utah Beach. And then the British 6th Airborne with Canadian paratroopers, and James can tell you all about paratroopers later. They were dropped about 50 miles further to the east by the Caen Canal and the Orne River, right at the other far. So you've got 2 shoulders of this bridgehead. To the west, the Americans, and to the east, mainly the British. Then you had over 175,000 Allied troops land from the sea. Very high casualties. I follow a couple of guys on Omaha Beach, in particular the first officer to break out, a guy called Lieutenant John Spaulding from the Big Red One. And Americans lost over 900 lives on Omaha Beach. The Canadians lost around 300 on Juno, and it was around about the same for the British on their beaches. But by far the highest losses were incurred by the Americans on Omaha Beach, and that's why you have films like Saving Private Ryan, my book, The Bedford Boys There, which is a book I wrote 20 years ago, was about a community in Bedford, Virginia that lost 19 guys on D-Day. So yeah, I take these various characters, and you start pretty early, and you're getting into that. You're there in that C-47 cockpit with Joel Crouch as he revs those engines up, and you hear that thunder of those C-47 engines, and those guys are sitting there in a shaking plane about to do a very important job indeed.
Well, I was telling James earlier, whenever I would come across any aviation in there, which I could understand a little better than some of the paratrooping, although I almost feel like I'm ready to put on a parachute after reading your books. But I was reading about the Horsa gliders, which now the Horsa gliders were the British, and then I think it's CG, I've forgotten the name of the American gliders, but the Horsa gliders were a little heavier, that were pulled by I think it's the Halifax bomber, and probably some others. But that is a tenuous job, both as the tractor and as the glider. Our son Marshall, he's gotten his glider rating, and we kind of teased him because after I had my single engine landing, he went out and got his glider rating, and I told him, okay, this one-upmanship is going to have to stop. But he said that flying behind a tractor in tow, it's precarious for both aircraft because just the simple gravity determines that if you raise your nose, then you're going to decel, and if you're the glider and you raise your nose and decel, you're putting more tension. You'll either snap the cord, or if it's a cable like they use now, you'll pull the tractor, and can send both of you into oscillations that you won't be able to control after a while. And some of these guys, they did this with crazy weight in the back in these gliders. I mean, Jeeps and gear, heavy guns and things. And when they did this, none of them had parachutes, and there was, anyway, just that amount of flying in formation with no thrust levers of your own is, I mean, my hat's off. That's some varsity aviating. And so whenever they went in, one of the things that I'd always wondered, and it was great to read your books to understand it better, but I always wondered, why wasn't there air cover, or why wasn't the Navy shelling those beaches to keep the German heads down while our boys were coming on the beach and climbing those cliffs?
Well, they did do that in some places, and the problem was that D-Day is a very complicated big picture. So on Utah, for example, you had Liberator bombers. You had over 300 Liberator bombers that came along around about, the last wave of bombers came around about, it was about 628 was the last bomber to fly across Utah Beach. Now it's the 4th Division, the Ivy Division, that landed and had very few casualties. I mean, less than 200. So you have to remember, in an amphibious invasion, the planners estimated in World War II that you maybe had 20% casualties, yeah? Killed, wounded, taken prisoner. So in Utah, they landed over 28,000 men, Americans, on Utah Beach on D-Day, and they had less than 200 casualties. Very, very small percentage of casualties. Massive success on D-Day. It's the big American success. And the reason why there were so few casualties is because the US 9th Air Force sent over 300 Liberator bombers, and the beach, imagine the beaches like that, the Liberators came along parallel to the beach and they just bombed the hell out of it. I mean, it was just absolutely astonishingly successful. Probably the most successful carpet bombing, I think, in US history. I mean, you guys did a really good job in Vietnam sometimes. But this is like the ultimate carpet bombing. And they just destroyed nearly all their beach defenses. So when the landing craft came in later, just a few minutes later, literally the Germans, most of the Germans had been killed, or they were stunned, or they were shell-shocked. And it was relatively, it wasn't easy, but it was pretty smooth sailing for a lot of those guys when they came in at Utah. Now, Omaha was different. We were supposed to bomb beforehand, just as we did at Utah. But imagine the beaches like that. Instead of going parallel like that, so that, if you missed one target, the bomb would bounce, or you just cluster along and you'd hit in a line. I'm sure that you could explain this in much more convincing detail if you bomb like that across targets, rather than if you come across like this. Now we had very low cloud cover, dense cloud cover on D-Day early in the morning. So the bombers, they had, if you're flying like that at 10,000 feet, the cloud cover was down to 3,000 feet, very low, as you would know. How do you time the bombs so that as you fly over, you can't see below you? How do you time them so that you hit like literally a 150-yard wide strip of defenses? It's pretty much. Right. I mean, you can tell me. But then they were worried. They were worried that the bombing, which was the most crucial part of the pre-invasion plan on Omaha Beach, where we lost almost 1,000 men killed. They timed the bombs to be dropped by just a few extra seconds, because they were worried if they came over here and the troops were down here, that if they bombed, then a lot of guys, there'd be a lot of friendly fire, and they'd actually bomb the guys as they landed. So they timed it for just a couple of extra seconds. So we killed a lot of cows inland. I mean, like hundreds of cows, 2,000 French civilians killed on D-Day, a lot. But we didn't kill a single German in the pre-invasion bombing from the air on Omaha Beach. So when the guys arrived, the Germans were just sitting there, pre-sighted, 12 very, very well defended, very heavily armed defensive positions. The only way you could get off the beach was with 5 draws, 5 road exits. The bluffs are around about 100 feet. The beach is curved like a crescent, so you could get shot in the side, the back. I mean, it was just an absolute killing zone. And because we failed to bomb properly, a lot of guys got killed. It was a disaster. A lot of people were to blame. The planning was really poor. But when the Navy finally got called in later in the morning, so H hour, the first Americans landed at 6:30 a lot of them were wiped out. Certainly, there were 8 sectors on Omaha Beach, and some sectors you had over 70, 80% casualties. Bedford Boys, that unit there was 180. They were the only people to land in the right place at the right time on D-Day on Omaha Beach. And out of this one company, A company, there were 180 guys, 112 were killed. So it's not wounded, that's not traumatized. I mean, it's just a bloodbath, slaughter, like
Right.
Tim Private Ryan shows you. But later on, we had some guys, we had lieutenants, we had young, really, really, very, very brave, just amazing human beings that were in combat for the first time. You can't really ever be trained for this, because, you know, when people start shooting at you and you see body parts flying everywhere and you're in trauma and your heartbeat's just skyrocketing, you've either got it or you haven't, you know. And we fortunately had enough young combat commanders who had the guts and the will and the calm to stand up and lead their men off that beach, and most importantly, to begin communication from Omaha, from the beach, to the US Navy, which was 5 miles out at sea. And we started sending radio messages when we could, and the Navy came in, and we had several examples of boats actually scraping the bottom of the ocean, getting as close as they possibly could, and then just pounding the hell out of the German defensive positions that should have been destroyed by the bombers and that were destroyed on Utah. So a lot of things went wrong, but, you know, this is war. It's, you know, like von Moltke, the famous German general, said that, you know, you can make the most perfect plans, but the moment the first shot's fired, it all goes to hell and it's complete chaos, you know? So
well, and I
it's
think
all about managing,
where...
it's all about managing chaos, but you need people to lead. You need people to move forward and to lead others. And, you know, the point is that when we liberated Europe, when Americans liberated Europe, it took from July 1943 to May of 1945. And you went from North Africa, then you went to Sicily, first time you landed in mainland Europe. And you had to get up every day almost. Yanks, Brits, Canadians, but particularly, we're talking about Americans now because it's American. You had to get up every goddamn day for almost 2 years and move towards the enemy. So you had to advance. You weren't moving back. That's not the point. Back is across the Atlantic in the US. You've got to get to Berlin, and the quicker you get to goddamn Berlin and we defeat these Nazis, the less lives are going to be lost, the quicker we can restore democracy and civilization and decency and human rights to Europe, which was enslaved. So you got to get up, expose yourself. You have to advance, you have to attack. And it took real guts and courage to do that day after day.
You know, one of the stories that since I was reading your book, whenever I was working out, I'd put on a documentary just to kind of flesh out some of the details. And I think that human element that you were pointing to, you know, things go wrong. You can make great plans, but when things go wrong, you've got to have somebody in charge that has some creativity and flexibility so that they figure out a way. And the human mind and will is kind of unfathomable sometimes. And I remember this older gentleman now being interviewed, and he was 19 when he jumped off the boat into the water, couldn't swim. The water's up to his chin, but he said, and he's so calm about it, he said, I couldn't swim, but the 90-pound rucksack kept my feet on the ground so that even though the waves were hitting me pretty hard, I could stay upright and walk towards the beach. And I'm thinking, where people are shooting at you, you know, but that tenacity and that just no room for victimhood. I mean, there was no, like you say, we're not going back. That's the Atlantic. We're going forward, and the quicker we get to our objective, the sooner we go home. And so many, the Canadians and others, the British, you know, obviously they were close enough. They had felt some of the Führer's hand-picked fury, but so many of the men and the women, but these books are talking about the men of that day, that they were fighting for freedom. They weren't fighting to protect their house, their home, their family. They were fighting to protect freedom for more than themselves. So it was such a selfless battle that you can't but be in awe of the people that.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I kind of picked the only I will say this: it's the only war that most people think was a good war. Now, no war is good, but
Right.
that if there's one that is relatively good, where you can justify more or less what happened, it was the Second World War. I don't think any other war in modern history has been, to be honest, morally justifiable in the way that liberating Europe was. So let's forget about the Pacific, because America was attacked at Pearl Harbor. That was a horrible, disgusting militarist regime that controlled Japan and wrought immense evil, and needed to
They
be.
did to the Pacific what what Hitler had done to Europe, and that's something I don't think a lot of people realize is what the Japanese had done in Manchuria and things like that.
They killed a lot more people. Japanese did. I mean, go and ask the Chinese. But my point is that liberating Europe from Nazism, from the forces of genocide that murdered industrially homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholic priests. The list was very long by the end of the war of people that were there to be decapitated or gassed or whatever hung on fish hooks. That was a favorite thing at the end for Germans who were disobedient and disloyal. But let's not forget the 6 million Jews. I think it's 9 out of 10 Polish Jews were murdered, and they did it really quickly and very efficiently. This was a very sophisticated, murderous machine, and we stopped that. We liberated people from that. We saved the Jewish race in Europe. There wouldn't be any left. Imagine if we hadn't landed on D-Day, if we hadn't won in Europe. Do you think there'd be many Jews left? No. So. Right. I think my point is that it was a just cause. It was a great crusade, and it's something that Americans should always be very really proud of, because I think it was your greatest hour. I mean, 1945. If you think about it, the end of the Pacific War came in officially in September of 1945. So today, 76 years ago, end of 1945, America is like the world superpower. But it's a superpower with moral authority. It's because it's defeated fascism, authoritarianism, and virulent genocidal racism in 2 parts of the globe. 1940, late 1930s, you had less than 75,000 Americans in the army. It was federally limited. To go from that to actually kicking 2 very, very, very powerful, sophisticated, evil regimes' asses in less than 4 years was a phenomenal. That's the length of a presidency, a phenomenal achievement. And then you have to think about the world that came after that. So, this is why people have always, whatever America's done in the world, this is why people have always admired and respected it at its core, because we know I've lived in this country for a long time, but we look at that moment, we look at that achievement, we look at what was done on Omaha Beach, we look at what was done in the Pacific, Iwo Jima and many other places in World War II. And we look at what was achieved, and we think, that was pretty damn generous. You gave an awful lot of lives so that we could have peace and democracy for the last 76 years. And I think it's something that will always be celebrated, should always be celebrated, and is America's finest hour, because it certainly wasn't Korea, it certainly wasn't Vietnam, it certainly wasn't Iraq, and it certainly wasn't Afghanistan. As we've seen, as history has proven to us. But World War II. Wow, what a job. What a fantastic, inspiring, amazing achievement.
Well, and I certainly wouldn't take away from those individuals that participated in those. I know that there's, we will never be a perfect country until every one of us are perfect people. So, we will continue to strive. But Alex, thank you so much for your time. I have one question for you that it came in. Okay. Could you tell us the date that The Liberator will air?
It's on 11th of November on Netflix. This Veterans Day.
All right. Great. Well, thank you. And thanks for your time today. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. You've been awesome. Thank you.
Bye, Alex.
Bye.
Bye, Alex.
Hey, mate. Oh.
All right. We are moving on to James. James Fenelon. Is that correct, James?
Yep, you got it.
Very good. And James wrote this book. Forgive my feathers in your book, but there was so many good quotes and good parts. 4 Hours of Fury. This is one that is kind of singular in that James wrote about what he is actually trained to do himself. But let me read you a little bit about him. James Fenelon is a paratrooper turned author of 4 Hours of Fury, the untold story of Operation Varsity. So we just talked a little bit about Operation Overlord, which was the D-Day invasion of Normandy Beach. Now we're moving to the other bookend, and this is Operation Varsity, the American 17th Airborne Division's combat jump over the Rhine River in March 1945. Fenelon's motivation to write about this massive airdrop originated with his love of history and his time in the military. He served for over a decade and is a graduate of the U.S. Army's Airborne, Jumpmaster, and Pathfinder schools. As an author, Fenelon leverages the perspective he gained during his service to provide readers with absorbing accounts of average GIs swept up by events beyond their control. His desire to give readers a boots on the ground view of events is reflected in his narrative-driven writing style. Fenelon's avid interest and dedication to the study of World War II combat has taken him to numerous battlefields and historically related sites, including those in southern France, Italy, Britain, Holland, Belgium, Egypt, Germany, and Crete. Additionally, he has made multiple trips in Normandy, including, and this is amazing, parachuting out of a C-47 near Ranville as part of D-Day's 60th anniversary commemoration ceremony. That's pretty cool, James. Fenelon is a regular contributor to World War II magazine and has been previously published in Fly Past, Britain's largest selling aviation magazine. Leveraging his expertise in military history, he's consulted as a technical advisor for video games, screenplays, and documentaries. Well, James, you have lived the warrior's life. So whenever you write, we get to see a little bit from behind the eyes of a Pathfinder. I have to read one quote from your book that it was towards the beginning and it just kind of gripped me. It's on the first page of chapter 1. I'll get to it here just a second. And it's a young man from North Dakota, and he's going, and as he stood there in the snow, he had seen a 23-year-old rifleman, and he's looking down at a German soldier that has died, and a nagging unease took hold of him. His thought was, he had no desire to kill these people. And it just made me think of that G.K. Chesterton quote, a true soldier doesn't fight because he hates what's in front of him. He fights because he loves what is behind him. And this book, only love could propel you to do the things these guys did. First of all, set it up for us. Tell us about what the 4 Hours of Fury was.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a great segue to start with Alex, who's always a tough act to follow. But before I started, I wanted to thank you, Tammie Jo, for hosting, and thank you everybody who's dialed in for our session today. It's kind of an interesting one to do it under the current circumstances of virtual, but I appreciate your time and everybody's time who's joined. So as Alex had mentioned, D-Day, the term D-Day was used in numerous events throughout World War II to signify the day of a specific invasion that was related to it, whether that be Operation Overlord, which Alex just spoke of, or one of the largest follow-on invasions, which was Operation Plunder or /Varsity, which was the crossing of the Rhine River in March of 1945. In that case, and in the case of the book that I've written, covers the D-Day of March 24th, 1945, which following the landing in Normandy was one of the largest invasions. After that invasion, 5 divisions were crossing the Rhine River on a 22-mile front under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery. And as part of that operation, again, similar to the layout and orchestration of Overlord, the Allies dropped 2 divisions on the far side of the Rhine to seize objectives and to block German reinforcements from attacking the units that were pushing across the Rhine River. And in that case, it was the British 6th Airborne Division who had also jumped in Operation Overlord. They had jumped on the British flank, as Alex mentioned. John Howard, who he mentioned, seized one of the bridges. He was in the 6th Airborne Division. And then the other airborne division to drop in to Operation Varsity was the American 17th Airborne Division. And that is who I predominantly focus on in the book, is the American 17th Airborne Division. They were one of 5 airborne divisions that the Americans fielded during the war. One of the lesser known divisions. I think everybody who's familiar with World War II history is rightly familiar with, the 101st Airborne, the Band of Brothers, so to speak. If you dig a little bit deeper, you're probably familiar with the 82nd Airborne, who is still our premier airborne division today. And so the 17th was one of these, like many American units, that were formed specifically at the beginning of the war, and then whose lineage kind of dropped off the roster, so to speak, after the unit was disbanded upon the successful conclusion of World War II. And so they've kind of been forgotten in history, if you will. And Operation Varsity itself is one of the lesser known operations, despite it being one of the largest and most successful of the war.
Right. I have to say, I don't consider myself a student of World War II history at all, but I certainly have read and enjoyed a number of World War II books and documentaries, and I had not come across Varsity. And it's 17,000 paratroopers at one time, and coordinating that and just garnering enough aircraft to do it. One of the things that Alex spoke of, having a stick of paratroopers, and tell us what a stick is.
Sure. A stick is simply the line of paratroopers who are hooked up, in the case of the C-47, roughly 18 to 20 guys, combat equipped, could fit inside of a C-47. And the stick is just kind of the slang term for the guys once they've lined up, and one of them standing in the door, and they're waiting for that jump caution light to flash from red to green to give them the signal to then exit.
And one of the things that really struck me between the two books is Alex and those paratroopers and those men and glider pilots and glider riders, they were coming into occupied France. So they could, of course, expect opposition, but the civilian population was looking for them, hoping for them. Most of them. Certainly there was the Vichy French that were not. They were certainly Nazi sympathizers. But now in your book, these paratroopers are going into the German homeland. And Germany started both world wars and have never had to fight on their own homeland. And now they've had years of indoctrination that, when the Allies come, they will murder you. They will torture and kill women and children. They just had this. So these guys were going into complete animosity. And I think that's such a big difference of what one got to, what one could expect and what one didn't. You also chose some really interesting characters. And how did you choose these guys? And were any of them people that you could interview?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It was one of the privileges of getting to write the book, was to meet several of these veterans who participated in it. And the way I kind of selected the personalities of the veterans to kind of tell the story, it was like Alex, I've read plenty of military history, and I prefer narrative-driven nonfiction that gives you the history, but with the taste of what the people who were living through it were experiencing it. And so I really wanted to pick a swath, if you will, of veterans to give the readers an appreciation of how the events unfolded, and to also share the level of uncertainty that many of these guys were facing. And I think, when we look back at World War II now, it's easy to forget that winning it wasn't always a given thing in many cases, right? It's well-known history. We always want to believe that the good guys are going to win and the bad guys aren't. And it's important, though, to remember to some of the points that you brought up earlier. You know, these were all young men who, even if you wanted to be optimistic and think that the outcome of a battle was certain due to the number of bombers, the number of tanks, the number of infantry you were sending across, the uncertainty of if you were going to make it that day was certainly never a given, right? And so I think you know, I wanted characters to kind of juxtaposition against the guys who were jumping out of the planes or landing in the gliders, who in many cases didn't even know where they were going, versus the guys who were making the plans and coming up with the strategy and drawing arrows on maps that then these other groups of veterans and characters kind of had to then go take that plan and execute against it. And so one of the goals was to really kind of juxtaposition the different experiences between, you know, commanders and generals who have the ability to see the big picture and understand what's going on, as opposed to, you know, the ground pounders and the infantry, the guys who just find out about where they're going, in some cases 4 days before the operation is supposed to take place. You know, they're ushered into barbed wired camps where they are then, you know, given their briefings and what's supposed to unfold and how the plan is going to be executed. And so I kind of just chose groups from those you know, across those experiences. And then fortunately I was able to interview a number of them. It took me, you know, a little over 7-8 years to write this book. And so of course I had the luxury of more veterans being alive at that point in time, and had the privilege of getting to talk with them and in some cases become their friends.
You know, I have to pull out a couple of individuals, and one of the things that I think drives home the sacrifice that was made in this war and for our freedom is some of the people that you chose didn't make it. You know, you're reading their story and you're going, this is amazing. And then they're cut down. I think about, I think it was Lieutenant Edward Keenan, and how when he and his men got down to the ground, and the Germans had you would know the right kind of gun, but it was a larger gun, and they were with a machine gun fire keeping he and his men pinned down. And he had been pinned down by machine gun fire before, and he knew what would happen if they just stayed there. So he gets up and charges this machine gun group with a rifle. And of course he's hit. He gets up again and keeps charging. And of course, then he gets just really knocked down. He keeps crawling so that he is close enough to throw a grenade in and finish the gun group, so that his group could get up and move to safety and keep fighting. But I just sat there and I thought, okay, I just need to give this man's memory a moment of honor. It was so striking how selfless, not just signing up, not just training, because the training, we don't even go into that, but men like this, they don't go do what they do just off the back porch. They went through an immense tough training and then did this. There was another one that I thought showed just kind of some of the beauty of the human soul in Sergeant John Chesterton. By making his personal comfort a low priority, he was able to be at peace he was able to be at the right place at the right time, and how he would send his money home. My dad passed recently, and he had served during the Korean War, and going through some of his things and talking to my mom about it, I came across these pictures that prompted questions. And my dad, I knew that he had sold his cigarettes one at a time, and then he had also done haircuts, but he sent every check home uncashed to his folks. And I think that selflessness is generational, and I think part of it is what we teach our children. And I think there's people that teach their children that in every generation, but it was very notable in the characters that were shown here.
Yeah, Don Chester was one of those great products of the Depression, who, you know, was one of those kind of those, you know, those guys that you see in the movie, you know, who arrive in the Army and actually think it's a lot easier in the Army than it was in their regular life, because he got to sleep in the Army. He could sleep until, you know, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, as opposed to having to get up on the farm
Right.
at 3 o'clock in the morning. He had 3 square meals every day, as opposed to, you know, at home during the Depression, it wasn't always guaranteed that you were going to eat. And so I think
Right.
that, you know, he was one of those guys that kind of carried that burden from him. And then when he got into the Army, he realized that that money could be better used by his family back home. And he had what he needed, by and large, provided by the Army itself. And so he just kept a couple of dollars and sent the
Yeah.
rest back home.
And the key there is having that thought process of, I have what I need. I don't have everything I want. I have what I need, and being generous with the rest of it. I have a question for you from someone watching, and this is it. Does James have an opinion why Operation Varsity has not received the recognition that others have received?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think there's a couple of aspects to that answer, and I think one of them is it was largely a British operation. So as I mentioned, the commander of it was Montgomery. It was largely in the British sector, which was the plan all along. You know, you've got the bridge at Remagen, which was made famous by Omar Bradley and General Patton seizing that bridge on the fly, if you will. The Americans and the British had a very different view of how they wanted to cross the Rhine. The Americans wanted to cross it on the fly, if you will, meaning that they wanted to rush forward as fast as possible and to get a bridge before the Germans could destroy it. Montgomery and the British, on the other hand, were a little bit more content with just rolling up to the Rhine River. If they got a bridge, great. If they didn't get a bridge, that was okay too, because then they were going to start bringing up all their supplies and all of the pieces necessary to then make that assault crossing. So you've got that aspect of it. So in this country, you know, in America, plunder/varsity is a little less well known. You didn't have that many American units participating in it. And then the other aspect of that, I think, is that it happened relatively close to the end of the war. So this happened at the end of March 1945. As you all probably know, the war was over in early May of 1945. So it was just, you know, a little over a month before the end of the war was over. And then there was also a lot of misconceptions about the state of the German military machine at the end of the war. So, you know, even though the German army was by far a different place in 1945 than it was in 1940, 1939, it still was a pretty lethal organization. And it's, you know, another interesting juxtaposition between Alex's book and the end of the war is that the number of Americans killed in action in April of 1945, the last full month of the war, was almost the exact same number of Americans that were killed in June of 1944 when we came ashore in Normandy. So the war didn't kind of peter out as most people think, right? It's kind of like this mythology that's built up. As the closer we got to Germany, the less resistance there was. It wasn't as well organized, but it was just as deadly, and it took just as much fighting to end the war as it did to get onto the continent of Europe and fight our way across it.
That is probably one of my bigger takeaways from your book, is realizing how it was a fierce fight to the end. You know, they had the Führer behind them saying there will be no retreat. And reading a little bit about from the German side, which I really appreciated you. I don't know how you did that research so well, but getting, I think his name was Schlemm, who was in charge, and kind of getting to see what those commanders and those men were up against, because you know, you had the Führer, who was really kind of, I think, had already lost his mind, but giving directions from a bunker to the men that were out there and could see what was going on, and he took really little to no information from them and just made his own plans. But I want to put this out real quick. John Carey says hello from the UK. So
awesome.
so one of the things that I found interesting, we talked a little bit about just the gliders and this idea of we don't have enough bombers to pull all the gliders, so we'll just pull two of them. And
Right.
even though I think it was a Pratt and Whitney 1500 horsepower engine, I was amazed at what they pulled. And I think I'm going to give some stats here, not that you need to echo them, but 591 gliders made it across. I think there was 37 or so British gliders that either crumpled under the weight of what was in them or something happened and they didn't even make it across the Rhine. And these guys didn't have parachutes, so they perished in this. 20 plus American gliders lost before crossing the Rhine. And about how many people, if they weren't carrying a Jeep or something like that, about how many troops would be in a glider?
So yeah, to your earlier point, between the British Horsa glider and the American Waco CG-14 gliders, the British gliders were much bigger. They could almost hold, I believe, a full platoon, if I'm not mistaken. So they could hold almost, they could hold well over 28, 30 guys. The American gliders were much smaller, and they could carry one Jeep or a howitzer or probably 12 guys. Okay. But not all that.
One, yeah. I read my husband just a quote from it this morning, and it's a sobering quote in your book about one pilot going over the load, just double checking. And there again, it struck me how the pilots in that time, like right now, in the Navy, Air Force, wherever you are as a pilot, there's somebody that will pull the weather probably for you. And unless you're the lead, there's not, you study where you're going and what you're doing and things like that. But the payload and the weight, the CG and things like that, those are usually loadmaster issues, not pilot issues. But these pilots, they're operating on a thin group of people. So these pilots are out there checking their load before they get pulled on a rope, not a cable, by these bombers. And when he saw this medical trailer that would be pulled by the medical Jeep, and it was full of body bags. And that just stops you as a reader, because we're so used to, I think you said, we're used to the good guys winning and the bad guys not winning. But what it takes to win is sometimes lost on us, as we live in the land of the free and enjoy the freedoms that these men fought for.
Yeah, it's definitely sobering when you read the logistics. I mean, there was another thing, I can't remember if I put it in there or not, but I remember reading one of the operations orders for one of the parachute infantry regiments, and they wanted guys to bring their mattress covers and safety pins to serve as body bags if they didn't have enough body bags, because they were expecting so many casualties. And and that's right. To your point, that's a sobering realization. Is you can imagine you're being briefed on this mission, and then somebody adds a footnote of like, oh yeah, don't forget we need to bring mattress covers to put your buddies
basically in. Bring your own body bag.
Yeah.
I mean, that was very sobering. And the fact that with all that knowledge, they went ahead with fervor. And I was thinking, as you did this, I mean, you've been through the paratroop training, and was there anything new that jumped out at you? Maybe the way they used to do things, or something in your research, whenever you finished the book and you closed the transcript and you sent it off for printing and you step back, what was one of your takeaways?
Well, one, that those guys were a lot tougher than I was. But I think what one of the things that I really enjoyed about doing the research and learning more about my own branch of services history that is very different than what it is today. So, you know, paratroopers by default go through tough training because they want these young men and today young women to believe that they're elite, right? Because you have to have a certain bit of what I call an attitude problem to think that you're going to jump into enemy territory and then seize the day,
Win.
right? And to win, right? So you have to have that self-confidence. You have to be a bit cocky. You have to exert a certain amount of peer pressure amongst your comrades, because you don't want to be the weak link, and you don't want anybody else to be the weak link in this kind of scenario, right? Where you're jumping into enemy territory. And what one of the things that struck me was like, and I'm sure you're the same way in your own military career, right? The weekend safety briefing of like before you leave base, you know, you get this briefing that everybody tells you, don't do anything stupid, don't drown, you know, all this kind of, you know, drink too much. Well, in the 17th Airborne Division, the division commander was this guy named Bud Miley, who, when he was a battalion commander, used to give his guys, when he was the Army's first commander of an organized battalion of paratroopers, before he sent them out every weekend, he would encourage them to get in fights. And he would tell them that he would rather they come back on Sunday night with black eyes and scratches and torn uniforms than to hear a single story about one of his guys running from a fight. And so, you know, you just kind of look at the mindset and the attitude that he was trying to instill in these guys, because he knew what was coming up. He wasn't interested in a bunch of nice guys. He wanted to go into combat with guys who were willing to fight for each other, right? And that's what he really wanted to instill, was this notion of, these are your buddies. This is who you're going to go into combat next to. You need to be able to rely on them as much as they need to be able to rely on you. And oh, by the way, we're going to practice that by going to get in fights with tankers and military policemen and whoever else we can find until we get to Europe. Yeah.
Right. You know, I will say, when I closed the book, I thought, you know, I made the right choice. Standoff weapons are for me. I did enough hand-to-hand combat with my brothers that I realized, I need standoff weapons.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just checking to see our time and questions. But James, what a treat to get to speak to you, even virtually, because reading your book is, I would highly recommend anybody that wants to just read a good book, and of a new swath that we really haven't had a lot of information on. I'm kind of hoping that somebody soon will be making a movie out of this, or a miniseries, because it's very interesting, and it's a different breed of characters in this. And for your Christmas list, all the guys on my Christmas list going to get a copy. And awesome. I thank you for researching our history, because our kids, we had have two, and one of the things that I think they both left home with was a love of history, because it's not just good stories, they're true stories that they make up the facets of who we are. So thank you for the many years spent in research and interviews and making this book.
Awesome. Thank you for hosting today, and also thank you for your service, Tammie Jo. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for yours. Thank you, Karen.
Oh,
back
well,
to
thanks.
you.
Okay. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to our audience. I did want to mention, I think everyone on here has a reverence for history, and I would suggest following the social media accounts of all of our authors on the panel. I know Alex is on Twitter quite a bit, but posts a lot of military history, mainly on World War II. And then James, I think you're on Facebook and Instagram, and post both about history and your writing process, which is very interesting. And then Tammie Jo, your website and posts are also wonderful. So I would encourage you to follow these authors on their on their social media posts. And again, if you would like to purchase any of the books, if you purchase through our website, the Boerne Library does get a portion. Please try to get your orders in through the end of tonight. If possible,
Okay.
I'm going to try to turn in an order to our vendors in the morning. So thank you so much to all of our panelists today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
And our audience too. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.